When Donald Trump announced recently that he believed he was about to be arrested imminently, that was more than 2 weeks ago, he told his supporters that they should respond by protesting. He said, quote, "Protest, take our nation back. They are killing our nation. We must save America. Protest, protest, protest." He has made those calls for protests repeatedly. About a week ago, he issued this dark warning. He said, quote, "Potential death and destruction would occur if he was indicted." He said it would be, quote, "catastrophic for our country." He said, quote, "Our country is being destroyed as they tell us to be peaceful." Republican Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene joined the former president's calls for protests, announcing, quote, "Protesting is a constitutional right, and I'm going to New York on Tuesday to protest. We will not live in fear." Protest, protest, protest. The country is being destroyed. How could they tell us to be peaceful when the country is coming to an end? This is what it looked like today when Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene arrived outside the courthouse in downtown Manhattan for her promised protest. She got out of her big white car and was surrounded by a whole lot of security and news media. And then less than 10 minutes later, she was back in the car. And then she drove off as onlookers sort of shooed her away. The few people surrounding her car did tell her to get out of their city, but other than that, it was just kind of she was there and then she wasn't. You see a lot of cameras, but as Lawrence O'Donnell was saying today, having seen it in person, lots more media than there were actual protesters, certainly than there were Trump supporters. This was the wide view outside the courthouse this morning. The crowd that was there numbered in the hundreds, including tons of journalists and tourists, according to New York's NBC station. Citing early police estimates, they report that the pro-Trump crowd outnumbered the anti-Trump crowd a little bit. You can see one Trump supporter there waving a flag. It might be hard to spot, but there's at least, you know, a few MAGA hats you can see here and there, give or take. It's easier to see the television news crews in the foreground than it is easy to see anybody else. Also outside the courthouse, people were gathered in support of the indictment today. People with signs saying things like, "We believe Stormy Daniels," and effectively just celebrating the indictment. But again, it was pretty sparse. You could see some pro-Trump protesters standing in front of a small group of counter-protesters, separated by a bike rack, a bit of flag and sign waving. I mean, we can walk through all the images that we've got, but the bottom line is nothing major to report, nothing massive. And that's sort of a dog that didn't bark story. But it becomes an important dog that didn't bark story when you consider that Trump was ordering his supporters that they better bark, that they better respond, and they just didn't. Our friend Alex Wagner joins us now here as part of this special coverage. Alex, I have to ask your impression of that part of this story. I mean, I don't know that anybody had like a down and dirty true prediction as to what would happen, but not much of anything happened.
Yeah, death and destruction or just really bad traffic.
Yeah.
I was struck by the sort of poetic irony of Trump, who is such a creature of New York City, being arrested, setting in motion the sort of wheels of history in New York City. And that New York City is the place where he's calling his people to amass, to show this force. And nothing happens. And for someone who has staked so much of his reputation on his ability to sort of be a master of the universe of this town, not even, in some ways, more than Washington, D.C., this is the place that created Trump. And for him to come back to effectively his hometown for this moment, to demand that his people show up, and for it to be such a withering non-response, I wonder, you know, on this day of days, I'm sure there were a lot of things running through his head. But, you know, watching the car go down the highway, going down to Lower Manhattan, and, you know, he knows this place like probably no other place in his life. To be so resoundingly rejected by the Big Apple has to pierce Trump's psyche in a way that maybe other things don't necessarily.
You know, Reverend Sharpton talked about this, that, you know, Donald Trump is a creature of New York City, but of Queens. And it was always like a thing that bothered him, that he didn't want to be the Queens developer like his dad. He wanted to make it in Manhattan. He buys the Bonwit Teller epic department store where, by the way, my godmother used to work. She was one of the few black women who were allowed to be a clerk at Bonwit Teller. He rips down the beautiful artistic frescoes of Bonwit Teller, and the art community went crazy. They said this man is a heathen. He rips down this gorgeous artwork. He reconstructs it into this monstrosity. The architectural community said Trump Tower was a monstrosity. So he always felt this sense of rejection. That to your point, all he ever wanted was to make it in Manhattan. All he ever wanted was to have the New York Times write about him, be on the cover of Newsweek. These were his things. These were
the talismans of his life.
100%. And so there is a special indignity and I think a special humiliation to having to walk into that courthouse where the Central Park Five had to walk through. And while he's saying, kill him, put him to death, he has to walk in that same building with a black DA that he showers with disrespect, and he's in no control. The whole Manhattan myth of Trump. And the last thing I'll say is they filmed, The Apprentice in Trump Tower. But when I wrote my Trump book, one of the sort of facts that I found really fascinating was they took a conference room and they had to reno it. Because Trump Tower was still 80s old. It wasn't new, it wasn't fresh, it wasn't sparkly. It was all a lie. Everything about The Apprentice and him has always been a lie.
I think, though, that if you talk to domestic violent extremism experts, the parallel they draw is that, after 9/11, we were prepared to make sure no one ever got on an airplane with their shampoo ever again. But that wasn't what was planned, right? The face of international terrorism changed. After 1/6, the face of domestic violent extremism may have changed. And what security experts are more afraid of isn't necessarily another January 6th, but another storming of the FBI field office, which happened after Mar-a-Lago. And I think there's still, I sense a lot of anxiety about a lone wolf who watches the coverage or watched Trump's speech, which apparently was grievance-filled. Jesse Waters yesterday called DA Alvin Bragg a felon and suggested he self-indict, or reported that someone was calling on him to do that. Donald Trump Jr., while the judge was saying the things he was saying from the transcript you read, was disseminating pictures of the judge's daughter. They don't care. They don't care that they've been rejected in New York, because I think the truth is Donald Trump has command and control over a movement you understand very well, a militia movement and a domestic and a group that has among its members or associated or adjacent to them people who could be prone to carry out acts inspired by domestic violent extremism.
I think the thing that is truly incendiary, though, in sort of the health of the democracy is when you get extremists, particularly armed extremists, wedded to people with real political power, right? And when you've got people with real political power who are willing to erase the distinction between run-of-the-mill electoral extremism and violent extremism, that's when you get a country that teeters on the edge of no longer potentially being a democracy. And in this case, I think what you were saying earlier about this being a regulated space and there being a judge that now gets something to say about what Trump is allowed to say and not say about the various actors in this case. And there's potential jail time penalties if he violates those. If we go in that direction with this case, that's a real test as to whether or not you can stay a mainstream figure with electoral sway while also playing footsie with fascism, while also encouraging the most violent extremists.
They're in tension like they've never been.
And there is real deterrence there. Everyone at this table has covered all the ways that our system doesn't work. And yet there's a sliver here, and it may be growing, of where the system is working. Because some of those extremists you mentioned were convicted. Sedition is a convicted crime here. Some people are serving long sentences, even as we cover others who got away. There has been talk about the old Donald Trump and some idea of Teflon. Well, anyone living in reality saw a lot of that Teflon stripped today, if it was ever there, and it was been long stripped from people like Weisselberg. He couldn't keep his money man out of Rikers. Even when he was president, there were a lot of people that, while later he tried to use the pardon power, his campaign chair, Manafort, went to prison. We know that. Bannon, you did a run through this the other night, Rachel, where that all stacks up. So when the pawns are getting in trouble and some of the other players on the board are in trouble, and then he can't amass this now this week, I think it continues to strip it away, where, no, we're not documenting, we're not trying to cover arms race to another January 6th. And yet we are accurately covering that he threatened this, he warned this, enough that he got in trouble today. But he doesn't have that. He doesn't have that support, partly because he's gotten so many people in so much trouble. And now, what is the ultimate indignity? Whether he's convicted or not, he's presumed innocent. Everyone can see, protect you. He can't even protect himself.
Yeah, that's right. And it's